Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Today, we are going to look at Chapter 3 in the textbook, Demand and Supply. This is going to help us understand markets better. Remember, markets are anywhere where goods and services are being exchanged between buyers and sellers. And so what we're going to look at is how markets function and why economists like them so much. So we'll talk about demand, the law of demand, supply, equilibrium. All these ideas are going to come into play. So without further ado, pull up your slides, grab your textbook, and let's get started. Okay. So, as I said, this is Chapter 3, looking at demand and supply. And so what we're going to do is look at first just demand and supply individually, independently, figure out what those are, and then we're going to put them together and talk about equilibrium in the market for goods and services. After that, we'll talk about what shifts these curves, what creates changes in demand and supply. We'll talk about changes in equilibrium, and that'll be a 4-step process to sort of solve any change or any disturbance to equilibrium and help us really understand how equilibrium is determined. And then the last 2 things we'll look at are first price ceilings and price floors, which are going to move us away from equilibrium. And then the last thing we'll do to wrap up is talk about how demand and supply give us efficiency, why it's so important to economists, why we think it's the best way to organize economic activity. So that's our plan. Let's get started. So first we want to talk about why this is important. And one of the things that your textbook does a great job of is trying to relate this back to you. So when we think about things like organic produce, organic fruits and vegetables, they tend to be local. So you'd think they should cost less than things that are transported over long distances, right? If the transportation costs are less, shouldn't organic produce be less? The reality is, if you've been to the grocery store lately, usually organic produce is more expensive than conventional produce. And this gets at supply and demand. And this is what we're going to talk about because it's not just a function of the cost of producing it. It also has to do with the demand and supply associated with it. And so we're going to try today to get a really strong sense of how demand and supply work and what the effect that has on the prices and quantities that we face in markets. So to do that, first we're going to have to start with some terminology. So again, we're going to do a lot of new terms today, but they're all going to be related. And we'll start with demand because that's the side that we spend a lot of time on, right? We're all consumers in a lot of different markets, and so we demand goods and services. What we'll see is after we wrap up demand, we'll look at supply, and it's going to be parallel. It's going to be really similar to what we talked about in demand. So first of all, what is demand? Demand is the amount of a good or service that consumers are willing and able to purchase at each price. And price is just whatever a buyer pays for a single unit of that good or service. And we want to differentiate between 2 really similar but different concepts. Demand is the amount somebody is willing to pay for a good and service at each price. So it's sort of like a collection of price and quantity relationships. Quantity demanded is the total number of units of a good or service that people are willing to purchase at a given price. So you can think about demand as sort of a collection of price and quantity relationships, and then quantity demanded as being a single response or a quantity at a single given price, so like a point. And we'll look at another example of this, and that'll really help clarify it. When we deal with economics, we don't see a lot of really hard and fast rules, but we do have a few laws. And one of our laws is the law of demand. And the law of demand that says holding everything else constant, if price goes up, we're going to tend to see quantity demanded go down. And if price goes down, we're going to tend to see quantity demanded go up. And this makes sense to us intuitively, right? The more expensive something is, the less we're going to buy it. The cheaper something is, the more we're going to pay for it. So, gas prices have fluctuated a lot in the last year or 2, and that's changed our behavior. Maybe you put off a road trip when gas prices were high or started telecommuting or carpooling or taking the bus. But when gas prices go back down, we tend to demand more of that gasoline and decide to go on that road trip. And so we can see that behavior replicated in any market for any good, right? If burritos get more affordable, I'm going to buy more of them, right? But if they get more expensive, I might change my behavior and buy fewer of them. So that's what the law of demanded says. Price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. But if price goes down and things get cheaper, we're going to demand more of them. Quantity demanded will go up. And we see this relationship play out in two different things. We see it play out in what's called the demand schedule and in the demand curve. Now, the demand schedule is just a table that shows the relationship between price and quantity demanded. And so we can imagine a demand schedule being something that looks like this. I'm going to use two boards today to really illustrate this. So, a demand schedule is going to show us the relationship between price and quantity demanded. So let's say we're talking about gasoline. All right, hopefully that's a little bit easier to see. So we've got price and quantity demanded. And so what we want to see is, what is the quantity demanded at various prices? So we can start with, say, these are unrealistic prices, but these are the prices. This is the example that's in your textbook. So we'll use that. So we've got a price of $1. We've got a price of $1.20, $1.40. And what we want to see is, what's the quantity demanded at each price. So at $1, let's say the quantity demanded is 800, and I think it's in million gallons. So 800 gallons of gasoline, or 800 million gallons of gasoline. At $1.20, people are going to demand a little bit less gasoline, maybe only 700 million. At $1.40, they're only going to demand, say, 600 million. At $1.60, it's going to go down to 550 million gallons. At $1.80, it's going to go down to 500, and so on. And so here what we can see is, as the price goes up to, say, $2, quantity demanded goes down to, say, 460 gallons of gas. So this demand schedule is showing us the relationship between price and quantity demanded, and that gasoline obeys the law of demand, that as price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. As price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. And we'll put one more point in here, $2.20, and we'll see quantity demanded go down to 420 gallons. So that's the demand schedule. And it's a great tool for understanding demand and for looking at demand in a really clear, approachable way, right? We're all used to seeing prices and quantities of gasoline. The next thing we want to talk about is the demand curve. And remember, the demand curve is a line that shows the relationship between the price and quantity demanded, but all contained in one, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to graph the relationship between price and quantity demanded up here on my second board. And to do that, we're going to need an XY axis. And this is where we use a little bit of algebra. But we want to go ahead and on our Y axis, we're going to put price. And on our X axis, we're going to put quantity. So we have quantity down here and price up here. And I always like to title my graphs so that I can be really sure what market I'm talking about, what goods I'm talking about, just to be super duper clear. So in this case, we're talking about gasoline, and our quantity is in millions of gallons. Okay? And now we're going to plot some points. And I'm going to use a lot of color today to help it really pop for us. So we have our first point was that at a price of $1, we saw that demand was pretty high, 800 gallons, right? So we're going to put that all the way out here. Let's say that's 800 gallons. And so if if prices are low, quantity demanded is going to be really high. If price goes up to $1.20 or 140 or 160, you want to try and keep things scaled, but it can get a little tricky. The big idea here is to get a sense of the relationship, not to be so perfectly precise, but I'm going to try to be precise because it helps. So we got 160, we've got 180, and then we had $2 and $2.20. So here we can see price going up or down, and then we're going to have our quantity change too. So we're going to have, let's see, if that's 8, that's going to be 400. That'll be 600. That'll be 200. So we have our first point here. Based on our demand schedule, we can start to derive a demand curve. So at $1, quantity demanded is 800. At $1.20, quantity demanded is 700. That's going to be right here. At $1.40, quantity demanded is 600. At $1.60, quantity demanded is 550. So it's going to be like there. At $1.80, quantity demanded is 500, and so on. You just fill the points in on your graph, taking all the information from the demand schedule and putting it into the demand curve. And that's the secret, is that the demand curve and the demand schedule are saying the same thing. It's just one's a table and one's a graph, one's a curve. So $1.80 is 500, and then $2 is 460. So that's about here. And then 220 is 420. So all of those points put together give us a demand curve. Ooh. And it's always good to label your curves. The more you label your graph, the more clear it is, right? So here we can see the relationship between price and quantity is a negative relationship. As price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. As price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. So because of that law of demand, we are always going to have a downward sloping demand curve. That's what the law of demand says. It says this relationship between quantity and price is going to be a negative or a downward sloping relationship. So far, so good? Does that make sense? And we see this anywhere. Think about if you went to the store to buy soda, or if you were looking to rent an apartment. The cheaper the price, the more you're going to consume. Okay? Cool. So that gives us our demand curve. Let's go back to the slides. Okay, now we have our demand schedule. We have our demand curve. Here we can look at a really precise, beautiful graph from the textbook. And so this shows us that relationship. Here we have the high price, low quantity point at the demand curve top. And at the bottom, we have the low price, high quantity point. And all those points linked together give us our demand curve. So the demand schedule graphed is the demand curve. And the downward sloping demand curve illustrates that law of demand, that relationship between price and quantity demanded that economists expect in almost every case. And we'll talk about exceptions a little bit later. So now that we've talked about demand, we can talk about supply. And like I said, supply is going to be kind of like the other side of the coin, very similar to demand, just the other perspective. Demand is all about buying goods and services, being the consumer. Supply is about selling goods and services, being like the firm. And so the supply of something is the amount of the good or service that a producer is willing to supply at each price. And so just like with demand, we have supply and quantity supplied. really similar, but supply contains the relationship between price and quantity supplied. And then quantity supplied is just the total number of units that producers are willing to sell at a given price. So it's like a single point, not the whole curve or schedule. Just like with demand, we have the law of supply. And the law of supply says, hey, if you're a firm and price goes up, then you're going to want to sell more. But if price goes down, then the quantity supplied is going to go down. And so the law of supply is the same as the law of demand in the sense that it's a relationship between price and quantity supplied that we expect. But instead of being an inverse relationship, the law of supply is a positive relationship. So if price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. Price goes down, quantity supplied goes down. So far, so good? Okay. Also, similar to demand, we're going to see that we have a supply schedule and a supply curve. And it's exactly the same as what we saw on the demand side, only now we're looking at the producer side. So the supply schedule is a table that shows the relationship between quantity supplied and price, different quantities supplied at different prices. And then the supply curve is the illustration or the graphic representation of that relationship on an axis in price and quantity space. So let's go ahead and look at our example again of gasoline, only this time let's look at the supply schedule and the supply curve, okay? Okay, so we still have our demand schedule up, and I'm going to go ahead and add to it our supply schedule. So we've got our relationship between price and quantity demanded here. And now I'm going to add the relationship between price and quantity supplied. And I think we can use the same prices pretty much to get a sense of it. So with a price of $1, that's a pretty low price. Firms aren't going to want to supply a lot to the market. They want to make money. So we're going to assume that at a price of $1, quantity supplied is 500 million gallons. At a price of $1.20, supply is going to go up. Not supply, quantity supplied. At a price of $1.20, quantity supplied is going to go up, giving us that law of supply relationship. As price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. At a price of $1.40, quantity supplied is going to go up to 600. At a price of $1.60, it's going to go up to 640. And at a price of $1.80, it's going to go up to 680. And then at a price of $2, it'll go up to 700. And maybe at a price of $2.20, it goes up to 800. Cool? So this is the supply schedule. It's the price and quantity supplied. It's showing us that relationship, that law of supply relationship, and it's showing us the quantity supplied at each given price. To get the supply curve, we just graph that relationship on our same graph. And we can graph it independently or we can graph them together. So real quick, let's bounce back to the slides and then we'll come back and talk about how we put these together to get to our equilibrium. Okay? Okay. So here we see our reminder, the supply schedule and the supply curve. Supply schedule showing us that relationship between quantity supplied and price. The next thing we want to look at is the supply curve. And you can see here, it looks a lot like the demand curve, but it's different. The supply curve is created by graphing those points between price and quantity supplied in price and quantity space. But what we see is when the demand curve was downward sloping, showing the law of demand, here the supply curve is upward sloping, showing the relationship of the law of supply, that as price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. So here's the lowest price and the lowest quantity, and then as the prices go up, the quantity supplied goes up too. So that illustrates that law of supply. And it makes intuitive sense, right? When we think about it, if I'm a firm selling pens, the more I can sell the pens for, the more I'm going to want to sell the pens. The lower the price, maybe I can't invest in the best technology, I can't hire more people, I can't sell as many pens. Those kinds of things are the things we're going to talk about more later. The next thing we want to do, though, is we want to put supply and demand together. When we put supply and demand together, what we get is an equilibrium. Equilibrium is the combination of price and quantity where there is no economic pressure from surpluses or shortages. There's no incentive to change. It is the point where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. Equilibrium is where we want to be. It's where everyone is made best off. And at the end of the chapter, we'll talk more about what that means. But the basic idea is if we set demand equal to supply, equilibrium is where they intersect. There's an equilibrium price, where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. And there's an equilibrium quantity, and that's that quantity where demand is equal to supply at that certain price level. When we're not in equilibrium, we will have either excess supply or excess demand, and that's going to mean we either have a surplus, too much of something in the market, or a shortage, not enough being supplied, or demand exceeding supply. So let's put our demand and supply together, find our equilibrium, and then talk about what shortage and surplus might look like. Okay. So the first thing we want to see here is something you might have noticed already. If we look at our demand schedule and our supply schedule with the same prices, we can notice, okay, first of all, as price goes up, quantity demanded is going to go down, and quantity supplied is going to go up. So we're going to see them going in different directions. I guess I could change this. As price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. And as price goes down, quantity supplied goes down. Basically, they're going in different directions, right? As price is decreasing, we're going to see quantity demanded increase. And as price is decreasing, we're going to see quantity supplied decrease. That's those two different relationships. What is interesting and what we need when we look for that equilibrium is that they're gonna meet in the middle. So you might have noticed that at a price of $1.40, quantity demanded is 600 million gallons of gas, and quantity supplied is 600 million gallons of gas. That is mathematically the point where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. That's our equilibrium quantity. And I'm going to go ahead and call it Q star because it's my special happy equilibrium quantity. That also tells me that now I know the equilibrium price. The equilibrium price is the price at which quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. So that's going to be right here at $1.40. That's going to be my special P star, or equilibrium price. Cool? So we can use the demand schedule and the supply schedule to find equilibrium if we have it. If there's a point where quantity demand and quantity supplied are equal, that'll be our equilibrium. The other thing we can do is graph supply and demand together in the same space because they're both in price and quantity space, so we can graph them together. So at a price of $1, our quantity supplied was 500. At a price of $1.20, it was 550. At a price of $1.40, it was 600. That's our equilibrium. At a price of $1.60, our quantity supplied was 640, which would be about here. Maybe a little bit closer, like that. At a price of $1.80, it was 680. That'll be like there. At a price of $2, it was 700. That'll be like that. And then I'll just finish the curve out over there with a price of $2.20. And I'm going to graph this in a different color so we can see the difference. But if I connect these points from the supply schedule together, I get a supply curve that looks like that. And these points are based on that same supply schedule we talked about. And where's our equilibrium? It's where supply and demand are equal, where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. It's right here at 600 and $1.40, which was what we saw in the supply schedule and the demand schedule. So that'll be our equilibrium. That is our Q star and our P star. Cool? So that's our equilibrium. That's where we're the best off. And you can see it, right? Graphically, that's where those two curves intersect. Quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. What are we talking about when we talk about excess supply and excess demand? Well, that just is saying, hey, if we weren't at equilibrium, we wouldn't be the best off we could be. So let's say we want to pretend it's the 70s, not the 70s, but let's just say we want to pretend gas is cheap, right? I'm tired of high gas prices. You're tired of high gas prices. Let's pretend gas is $1. What would that look like using our graph? Well, if we look at gas being $1, I'm going to go ahead and use another color here to illustrate this. If gas was $1, we can see that quantity supplied would be, as given by our supply schedule and our curve, 500, and quantity demanded would be 800. That's because if the prices were lower, we would want to consume more gas. If price was $1, I would be cruising around the neighborhood like crazy. But firms wouldn't want to sell as much gasoline. And so what would happen is the quantity demanded over here, I'm going to call it QD, would be greater than the quantity supplied. We would have excess demand, also known as a shortage. And this is what happens, right? There's not enough gasoline to go around. There's long lines at the gas station, that kind of thing. That's what would happen if prices were too low. Quantity demanded would be greater than quantity supplied, creating a shortage in the market. So low prices, bad. What about high prices? Everybody likes high prices, right? Well, firms would, but what would happen if gas was $2? If gas was $2, we still have a problem. Now, quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, right? This is what's called excess supply. Firms are willing and able to supply tons of gasoline to the market at $2 a gallon, but we don't want to buy it. That's more expensive. So we don't want to buy as much as they're selling. So that's what's called a surplus or excess supply. And so anywhere where we aren't at equilibrium, we're going to be at one of these excess points. And what happens if supply is too high? We're not going to buy the gasoline. There's going to be too much on the market. And so firms are going to lower their price. As they lower their price, the difference between supply and demand gets smaller. So they lower their price again. And the difference between quantity supplied and quantity demanded gets smaller until we get down to equilibrium. At equilibrium, there's no incentive for firms to change their price. We're consuming everything they sell. If they raise prices, we'll buy less. If they lower prices, we'll buy more, but they don't want to sell as much. So anywhere where we're not at equilibrium, there's actually pressure for firms to change prices and consumers to change their behavior. That's why economists love equilibrium so much. Equilibrium is stable. There's no incentive to change behavior. We are consuming as much as firms are willing and able to sell at a given price. Does that make sense? It's our happy place. Think about it as the economics happy place, equilibrium. And it's one of the reasons why we think market economies are so great, why Adam Smith's idea of this invisible hand is so great. Because just by saying, hey, I want to pay less for gasoline, and firms saying, hey, I want to charge more, we get these demand and supply relationships that give us this equilibrium where we say, hey, I am only willing to buy 600 million gallons of gasoline at a price of $1.40. And firms agree. Okay? Okay, so now we know what equilibrium is. It's where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. There's an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. When we're not in equilibrium, we're going to have either a surplus, more supply than demand, or a shortage, demand exceeds supply. Those aren't good. So where we want to be is in equilibrium. Here you can see the graph from your textbook and from your slides, and it's a little bit clearer than what I talked about, than my messy graph here. But I always think sometimes it helps to see things in color and really see it come together to help make sense of it. So point E here is the equilibrium. At a price of $1.40, quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. If the price were higher, then firms would be willing to supply more than consumers wanted to buy. If the price were lower, the opposite is true. Consumers demand more than firms are willing to supply. Either way, outside of equilibrium, the economy is not as well off as it could be. Cool? So this helps us understand the importance of the supply and demand model and the efficiency of it. When we're in equilibrium, we're the most efficient because everything being produced is being consumed. Okay? So, now that we've got equilibrium, let's mess it up. Let's talk about what happens when things change. Okay? So first, we want to use a little bit of fancy economics lingo, and we want to talk about a phrase in Latin that economists use all the time. It's ceteris paribus. And ceteris paribus means other things being equal, or I like to say it, all else held constant. What we're basically saying is that we're going to change one thing at a time. And economists love to do that. In economics, we like to say, hey, here's our model, everything's good. Now what happens if we change one thing but hold everything else constant? And so when we talk about that assumption, we say ceteris paribus. It's the Latin phrase meaning everything else held constant or all other things being equal. Okay? So what we're going to look at is what happens to our model in equilibrium if we change one thing and have everything else stay the same. And that's what we use ceteris paribus to talk about. So what happens if we do something that changes demand or changes supply? And that's what this next section is going to talk about. It's going to talk about the factors that affect demand, the factors that affect supply. We're going to shift the demand and supply curves, and then we'll talk about how we can predict outcomes and find equilibria, the other equilibrium in the future. Okay? So we have our demand curve. Our demand curve tells us how much consumers want at a given price. That's our quantity demanded. What it shows us, our demand curve shows us, is the relationship between price and quantity. And we respond to changes in price. But that's not the only thing that determines how much we want to buy of something, right? If I tell you that Diet Coke got cheaper, that might mean you buy more of it, but how much more you buy depends on things, other things. How much you like Diet Coke, what your preferences are, whether it's healthy or not, other prices of other products. And so that's what we're going to look at now when we look at some of these other determinants of demand. So price is a determinant of demand. It gives us a quantity demanded at a different price, but it's not the only thing. So we also have factors that will change demand at every price. One of those factors is income. If your income goes up, what happens to the quantity of goods and services that you consume? Pretty much generally, we assume you're going to buy more of everything. If your income goes up, you're going to buy more gas, more food, more clothes, more, maybe you upgrade to Hulu Plus, right? So we're going to see consumption go up. That's not movement along the demand curve because it's not a change in price. Instead, it's a shift in the demand curve. So if we see an increase in income, we're going to expect that to shift the demand curve all else held constant or ceteris paribus. So let's see what that would look like. Let's say we increase income. It's going to mean you're going to be willing and able to buy more gasoline at every price. So your relationship, the way you react to price in terms of your quantity demanded, there's still going to be that relationship. But when your income is higher, you're just going to buy more at every price. So that's what we consider a non-price determinant of demand. And it's going to be something that shifts the demand curve out. If your income went down, then we might see your demand curve shift in. So if income increases, consumers purchase larger quantities, and that would push the demand curve out to the right. If income decreased, we would see demand decrease, and that would shift demand in to the left. And what we're saying here is that shifting the demand curve, changing income, is going to change quantity demanded at every price. So we start out with one initial demand curve here, D0 or D0. And if income goes up, we buy more at every price. If income goes down, we buy less at every price. Does that make sense? So there's more than one factor determining our demand. There's price, but it's also other stuff like income, like other factors that might play a role. So what are the other factors that might cause a shift in demand? Income is a big one. Also, changes in tastes and preferences. So when things become popular or unpopular, we see demand shift, quantity demanded at every price change. We can see changes in the composition of a population. So for example, we have an aging population, right? Baby boomers are getting older, and that means we're seeing an increase in consumption of healthcare. It's not because healthcare is more popular, it's because we have more older people. Regardless of the price, it's going to be a higher consumption at every price level. We can also see the price of related goods affect demand. So if the price of a complement or a substitute changes, a substitute is going to be anything that you would have instead. So in my soda example, if my soda price doesn't change, but the price of other sodas do, that might change my relationship, right? I might say, oh, wow, Shasta Cola got a lot cheaper. I'm going to buy less name brand cola. Or if I only have soda when I'm having pizza, if I love to have pizza and soda and pizza gets cheaper, I'm going to go out for pizza and soda more often. That's considered a complement. And then also changes about expectations. If you think you're going to make more money in the future, if you think something bad is going to happen, those are going to shift demand too. So factors that will shift the demand curve, changing the quantity demanded at every price, are going to be income, tastes and preferences, changes in the population demographics or composition, prices of related goods like substitutes and complements, and changes in expectations. Okay? Cool. So here is a great slide that you might want to copy down in your notes because it really summarizes these relationships, right? We can see here all the relationships between those non-price determinants, those other factors besides price that affect demand, and how an increase or a decrease is going to affect the demand curve, shifting it out or in. So all these factors can shift demand from D0 to D1, shift it out, or in the reverse can shift it in. So income goes up, demand shifts out. Price of a complement goes down, demand shifts out. Price of a substitute goes down, demand shifts in. So if you'll want to spend some time thinking about these and try to remember that a lot of this stuff is pretty intuitive, right? If two things go together and one gets more expensive, I'm going to buy less of both. That kind of thing. Okay? Sound good? All right. So when we think about these relationships, one of the things we think about is the relationship between income and other goods. And like I said, for most goods, when income goes up, we buy more of them, right? That's what we call a normal good. A normal good is one that you buy more of when your income goes up. But there are these things called inferior goods. And an inferior good is one where when your income goes up, you buy less of it. And it's always fun to try and think about what are some inferior goods that we interact with. My favorite is Top Ramen, right? Little packet of Top Ramen, super, super cheap. But if you make more money, you're going to buy less of it. You're going to buy fancier ramen, right? You might go out and go get pho or something. And so things like public transportation and really cheap produced food are things that we're going to buy less of as our income goes up. So we call those inferior goods. The other thing we've talked about here when we're talking about these non-price determinants is substitute goods and complement goods. Substitute goods are goods that take the place of each other. So if, let's say, coffee gets more expensive, I might buy more tea because I consider them substitutes. On the other hand, if donuts get more expensive and I consider those complements to coffee, two things that go together, more expensive donuts are going to affect my demand for coffee by making the entire experience of having both together more expensive. So think about a really good example of complements that go together really well are things like hot dogs and hot dog buns. If hot dogs get more expensive, you're going to buy fewer hot dog buns because the experience of having hot dogs and buns gets more expensive. So complements are goods that go together and substitutes are goods that exchange for each other. And they're both going to have an effect on the demand curve, shifting the demand curve. Okay? The next thing we want to look at is the supply side. And it's going to be a little bit similar, but it's going to be different. So remember, the supply curve shows the price a firm is willing to accept for a good. And so that upward sloping supply curve shows us quantity supplied at each given price. So in this case, on the supply curve, price determines quantity supplied, but it's not the only factor that determines quantity supplied. Other non-price determinants can influence supply and shift the supply curve. So what might be some of those things? We can imagine a world where if the cost of production goes up, we might see the firm charge more. We might see the firm increase the price if the cost of producing the good gets more expensive. So if I am out there in the world selling scarves and it gets more expensive to buy yarn, I'm not going to be able to charge the same price for my scarves that I would have before. So non-price determinants of supply can shift the supply curve in the same way that a non-price determinant of demand shifts the demand curve. So what are these non-price determinants of supply? A really, really simple common one is the cost of production. So let's go back to our original graph here and simplify this a little bit, make it a little bit clearer. So we had our demand curve here, and we had our supply curve right here. If I'm producing gasoline and transporting it gets more expensive, maybe there's a government regulation about tanker trucks or something like that, and it increases the cost of transporting gas, that's going to make it more expensive to produce gasoline. So to get the same amount of profit, I'm going to have to shift my supply curve in and charge a higher price at every quantity supplied. Do you see that? It's a lot like the graph here. So just think of it as being the exact same as shifting the demand curve. So if we see an increase in the cost of inputs, we're going to see the supply curve shift in, requiring a higher price. What if it gets cheaper? If it gets cheaper and instead we see, say, a lower cost of maybe the labor used to get gasoline, that would shift the supply curve out, meaning we could charge a lower price at every quantity. And so just like with demand, we can see supply shift in to the left or out to the right, depending on these other non-price factors. So what are the factors we're talking about? It's going to be anything that affects the cost of production, conditions in the environment, input prices like the price of labor, price of technology, the price of transportation. Technology can change the quantity supplied, or the technology can shift the supply curve. Sorry. So think about how computers have made things so much more efficient. That makes it cheaper to produce goods, shifting the supply curve out, right? And then government policies like regulations can raise or lower the cost associated with producing things. So all of those factors can shift supply, change the quantity supplied at every price. So it's going to be natural conditions, input prices, technology, and regulations. So say when the government imposes a regulation saying firms have to give healthcare benefits to their employees, that regulation raises the cost of production. That higher cost of production is going to shift supply in because firms are going to need to charge a higher price at every quantity. Does that make sense? So say going from here to here. Okay? So now we have factors that shift the demand curve and factors that shift the supply curve. Next, what we want to look at is how do we determine the effect of an economic event on our equilibrium? And so we're going to have a 4-step process. We're going to put the demand and supply model in equilibrium in its original state. We're going to say, okay, a change happened. Does it affect demand or supply? Is it a positive or a negative effect? And then draw the change and find the new equilibrium. Okay? It's really simple, and the more you do it, the easier it gets. So it's a really fun thing to practice, and you can kind of go over and over again as much as you want. So let's look at an example. Okay? Let's go back to the board. Okay, so let's look at the example in the textbook together. And this is an example that looks at the effect of good weather on salmon fishing. And so in the book, we've got price and we've got quantity demanded, and then we have quantity supplied at 2 different points. And so what we're going to see is we're going to start with the initial conditions, and then we're going to talk about how the weather changes the effect, the quantity supplied of salmon in the marketplace. So we're going to start out with a price of $2, and then we have $2.25, $2.50, $2.75, and $3. And the book actually even goes down to $3.25. I'm running out of room. Okay. And then we have our quantity demanded at each price, starting with $8.40, and then $6.80, $5.50, $4.50, $3.50, and $2.50. Quantity supplied in our first period is going to be, and we can see here real quick, as the price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. It's obeying the law of demand, right? Let's get that a little bit better. That's better. Okay. In 2014, quantity supplied was 80 at a price of $2, 120, 160, 200, and 230. And then 250. And we can go ahead and graph that relationship up here. And here's the thing, we can graph it specifically or we can graph it generally. And that's what the textbook means when it says sketch the graph. You can say, okay, well, we can draw those explicit, exact points, or we can generally put the relationship up. So let's put quantity and price of salmon. And then we're going to have our demand curve. And our supply curve. And we can use the demand and supply schedule to find the equilibrium point, which is going to be here at $3.25. Okay? So, our initial equilibrium is $2.50 at $3.25. Okay? Now, we want to think about what would happen if during the summer of the next year, the weather conditions were just perfect for commercial fishing. Heavy rains meant higher water levels, which helped the salmon. Cooler temperatures meant that there was a better food supply for the salmon. And so generally the conditions were really, really good. What would that mean? Well, if we had better conditions, that's going to mean there's more salmon. That means that there's going to be more supplied at every price level. And that's what the example in the supply schedule says. In our textbook example, they say, okay, well, in the next year, the conditions were excellent and the quantity supplied went from 80 to 400 and from 120 at a price of 225 to 480. It's still obeying the law of supply, but the quantity supplied is higher at every single price, right? Okay. And so on. Cool? And this is the same example that's in the textbook and it's in the slides. We'll look at it in just a second. But here you can see that what we would do in this case, the higher conditions would mean more salmon, which means the cost of production is going to go down. Which means we're going to see the supply curve shift out. At every price, there's more salmon available on the market. So that's going to look like this. And the new equilibrium is going to be much higher. $2.50, 550 units. And if this doesn't make sense, think about the opposite. What would happen if the weather conditions were really bad and there was a salmon shortage? That would shift the supply curve in, making it more expensive, right? We see that all the time. We had drought conditions meant there was a shortage of almonds. That's going to raise the price, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Let's look at another example. So let's say we're going to talk about, let's look at the example of newspapers and the internet. And so what we want to do here is start out with a market in equilibrium and then go through that 4-step process, right? So we start out with our market in equilibrium, quantity on the x-axis, price, up on the y, and we're going to look at newspapers. Starting out in equilibrium, with now, what happens if changes in tastes and preferences affect newspapers? So how many of you subscribe to the newspaper? Nobody, right? The internet means that fewer people want to read newspapers. So we have our initial equilibrium. Now we have to try our steps. Step 1, is that going to affect demand for newspapers or supply of newspapers? It's about demand, right? It's about consumer preferences. And so what you want to think about is try to keep it at the simple level. Don't overthink and go, oh, well, that means they're going to supply fewer. No, it just means if people use the internet more for their news, they're going to demand fewer newspapers. So it's going to be a demand side effect. Is demand going to go up or is demand going to go down? People are preferring fewer newspapers, so demand is going to go down. It's a decrease in tastes and preferences. So we're going to shift to the left. So now all we have to do is find the new equilibrium. And the new equilibrium is where the original supply curve and the new demand curve hit. Make sense? So here in the slides, we can see the exact same example play out. We have the supply and demand for salmon in the initial condition given by demand 0 and supply 0, and that initial equilibrium right here. And then we can see supply 1 is this new higher level of supply where we have really good conditions, increasing the quantity supplied of salmon at every single price level, shifting that supply curve out, resulting in lower prices and a higher equilibrium quantity. Cool? Here's the second example. So this is based on actual data from 2004 to 2012. The number of Americans who reported getting their news from digital sources increased from 34% to 39%. So is that going to affect demand or supply? We said it affects demand. Is it positive or negative? It's going to have a negative effect on the consumption of traditional news sources like newspapers. So it's going to shift demand for newspapers in to the left, lowering the equilibrium price and quantity. Newspapers aren't as valuable because people don't want them as much. Does that make sense? Hopefully. All right, here's another example that's a little bit more complicated. So this is a little bit of a discussion question. So think about an increase in labor compensation, otherwise known as wages, as well as an increase in digital communication. And how does that affect the U.S. Postal Service? So there's two things going on here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy these graphs on my chart up here. We're going to start out in price and quantity space. And we have an initial demand curve and an initial supply curve. And we're talking about the Postal Service. And two things are happening. First is higher labor compensation, basically higher wages. And what's that going to affect? Higher wages means it's going to be more expensive to provide a service, right? It's more costly inputs. So that's going to have an effect on supply, right? That's going to make the cost of production more expensive. It's going to affect supply. And is it going to be a positive or a negative effect? If it's more expensive to produce services, that's going to shift supply in, like this. So we're going to get a shift in of the supply curve from the initial level. And I forgot to put our equilibrium in there. Let me pop that in real quick. Boop, 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 boop. Q0, P0. But at the same time, we're seeing a change in tastes and preferences. People are using more digital communication and less traditional snail mail, right? So that's going to affect demand. So let's graph that up there too. Increase in digital, I'll just call it digital mail. That's going to affect the demand side. And is it going to shift demand out, increasing demand for mail, or shift demand in? More people using email and text messages and other forms of chat is going to decrease demand for traditional postal services. So that's going to shift demand curve in too. And so we'll have two things happen at once. We're going to have a new demand curve and a new supply curve. And that can happen too. And that'll give us a new equilibrium. That's going to give us a lower quantity. And depending on how far the two curves shift, we might see price go up or go down. So what we have to do to solve this problem is put those two shifts together, right? And so we can see here there's multiple equilibria, right? We started out here, and then higher wages took us up to here, whereas decreased demand took us down to here, which takes us all the way over to our new equilibrium over here. I guess that's equilibrium 3. Okay? So if we put the two diagrams together, we see that there's a total change based on both the decrease in supply and the decrease in demand. Cool? Does that make sense? So it can get more complicated, and we can really mess around and look at a lot of different things we see happen in the economy, and that'll really help us understand how these markets work. So the last thing we want to make sure of before we move on to the next section is that we have a sense of the difference between movements and shifts. So a shift is caused by one of those non-price determinants. So if there's a change in income, tastes and preferences, production costs, all of those things are going to cause a shift. A movement is when we just move along the curve, and that's a change in the quantity, not the curve itself. So let's say we start out here, and we're going to do the exact same example as before, except we're only going to have an increase in the wages associated with postal workers. So if we increase the wages for postal workers, we said that's going to decrease the supply. That's going to shift the supply curve in. So that's a shift, right? That's shifting a curve, in, and changing the quantity supplied at every price level. But along the demand curve, it's a movement along the curve. The change in supply is not a shift in the demand curve, it's movement along the demand curve and a shift in the supply curve. So that's the important thing. You want to think about the difference between shifting the whole curve, changing the quantity supplied at every price level, versus moving along the demand curve and just seeing a change in price and quantity demanded. Okay? All right. So the last thing we want to talk about are what's called price controls. And this is when the government puts in a rule to try and regulate prices. A price ceiling is a limit on how high a price can go. It's a maximum price. And the most common price ceiling is a rent control law. It says, hey, you can only charge so much for this apartment. A price floor is a minimum. It's a basement level. It's the lowest price you can legally pay for something. And the most common price floor is minimum wage laws. It says, hey, you can only pay people so little for their labor. You can't pay people less than $11 an hour, or $7 an hour is I think it's $7.75 is the federal minimum wage. And so these price controls are government regulations on the market. And that's what economists don't like about them, is they manipulate the market and they can lead to shortages and surpluses, just like we saw before. So, for example, if we have rent control in a market, let's go ahead and draw it together. And I really think it's really useful to practice drawing these curves on your own because it really helps you to understand it. So, we've got the market for, let's say, 2-bedroom apartments. And there's the price and the quantity. And we have some initial supply and demand, right? And that means there's some equilibrium price. So let's say there's some quantity here. And let's say the price for a 2-bedroom apartment right now is $2,000. It's a little cheap. Better than their example. Their example is $500. Okay. So that's our equilibrium. That's the market price. But if we have a rent control law, what they're going to say is, let's stop the price and say the price can't go above, let's just set it at $2,000, right? We set this as our rent control price. This will be our price ceiling. It's a limit on how high the price can go. If we see an increase in demand as more people move to Sacramento, we're going to be stuck because now at this price, the quantity supplied is here. But where's the quantity demanded? At that new higher price, the quantity demanded is going to be way higher. And so we're going to have a shortage. And that's why economists don't like price controls. With a price ceiling like rent control, we're going to tend to see shortages, not enough housing. At these low prices, more consumers want to rent and fewer firms want to sell or rent houses. And so there's going to be a shortage of housing. Okay? A price ceiling is only binding if the ceiling is below equilibrium. So if this is our new equilibrium, then the price ceiling is binding because the market wants the price to be a lot higher. But the law is saying, hey, no, the price can't go above $2,000, even if the market wants it to be that way. Okay? The other example is a price floor, and we can think about price floors being minimum wages. The book has the example of wheat limits on the wheat price and says, okay, well, imagine a world where the equilibrium price of wheat is at P0 and the price floor is set higher. I'm going to give you the example that we're all familiar with, which is minimum wage. So let's say we have the quantity of labor, and this is minimum wage labor. And minimum wage labor comes at a cost, which is the wages. And let's say we're looking for people to wash windows. There's some demand. and there's some supply, and there's an equilibrium wage, right? There are people who are willing to wash windows, and there are firms willing to pay those people to wash windows. And let's say there's 1,000 people willing to wash windows for $8 an hour. And there's 1,000 firms willing to hire them at $8 an hour. If there is a price floor above that $8 an hour, let's say there's a minimum wage that says, hey, no, you have to pay people at least $12 an hour, what's going to happen? More people will want to work. Maybe there's going to be 12,000 people trying to work, supplying their labor to the market. But fewer firms are going to want to hire people at that price, maybe only 800 people. And so what we're going to have is excess supply or surplus. And this surplus is going to be a surplus of labor, otherwise known as unemployment. More people supplying their labor to the market and fewer jobs for them. And so with a price floor above equilibrium, we're going to see a surplus. With a price ceiling below equilibrium, we are going to see a shortage. Either way, these price controls, if they're binding, are going to move us away from equilibrium and cause an inefficiency. Okay? So that leads us to the very last thing we're going to talk about today, which is the efficiency part. I've been talking about efficiency this whole time. What do I mean? What I mean is, in a market, one of the reasons we think markets are so efficient is because they give people the best. They give everybody the best well-being, and they're the best for society. And we measure that using these ideas of consumer surplus, producer surplus, and social surplus, or total welfare. Consumer surplus is the amount that individuals would have been willing to pay minus what they actually paid. It's the area above market price and below demand curve. And this comes from the idea that consumers have different willingnesses to pay. So if you are like me and you're a cheapo, you want to pay the lowest price. But some people, like some of my family members, are willing to pay more for things. There are people out there who are willing to pay, say, $15 for a burrito. I'd rather pay $7 or $8 for a burrito. The market says that we all pay the same price, right? We go to the restaurant, we go to the local food truck, and we buy a burrito, and they don't ask us, how much are you willing to pay? We just pay the market price. That means that along this demand curve, there are people who would have spent a lot more for that burrito and people who would have spent less. So up here, people with the highest willingness to pay. Down here, people with the lowest willingness to pay. Same for the supply curve. The supply curve shows us firms' costs, the minimum price they're willing to accept. These firms have the lowest cost, and these firms have the highest cost. A market economy ensures that the people with the highest willingness to pay enter the market first, and the firms with the lowest cost enter the market first. So if we look at our equilibrium, we can look at the benefit of the market by looking at how well off people are in terms of their consumer surplus, what they would have paid minus price, and producer surplus, what the firms need to get by minus price. And that gives us our total social surplus. So we have consumer surplus, the area beneath the demand curve and above the price line. And we have producer surplus, the area beneath the price line and above the supply curve. When we put them together, we get the total economic surplus, the total social surplus, the total welfare, the benefit to society. And this is where we're the best off. If we impose a price, binding price floor, then we're going to have a deadweight loss. If we impose a tax, we'll have a deadweight loss. If we move away from this equilibrium, we'll lose out on some of that surplus, some of that total welfare. And that's why economists love markets so much, because we believe that markets are going to maximize that total surplus, that economic well-being. And so you can look at the graph here from the textbook and see that sort of triangular shape of the demand curve and the price line, consumer surplus, and the price line and the supply curve being the producer surplus. And if we add them both together, we get the total welfare, the total benefit that society gets from engaging in market economic activity. And that's pretty great, right? I think so. Economists think so. When we impose a binding price control, whether it's a price ceiling or a price floor, we move away from that total surplus and we generate a deadweight loss. So, for example, if we were to put in a price ceiling that is, let's put in a price floor. Let's put in a price floor up here. I need a different color. Here we go. Now, at this price floor, the quantity demanded is going to be here. I'm going to call it QD. The quantity supplied is going to be here. I'm going to call it QS. And this is going to be the new price. What happens to consumer surplus? It gets smaller. Now it's just this triangle here. What happens to producer surplus? It gets bigger. Oh, I didn't spell floor right. I'm sorry. Producer surplus is now the area beneath the price up to the quantity being demanded. What happens to this, though? The other thing that happens is we miss out on this economic activity. This red triangle here, that is what's called deadweight loss. It's economic activity that would have taken place without the binding constraint, without the price floor, without the regulation. But because of the regulation, it doesn't happen. So in the examples here on the slides, if you look at this first example, reduced social surplus from a price ceiling, equilibrium price is $600 and quantity is $20,000. And that's where the economy is best off. Consumer surplus is T plus U, and producer surplus is VWX. But if we put a price ceiling in, now we're going to see the quantity, the equilibrium quantity reduced down to 15,000, and the price is going to be this 400. We're going to see producer surplus shrink to just that X area. Consumer surplus is now T plus V, but U and W, this other third triangle here, that's deadweight loss. That's economic activity that no longer happens. It's people who don't, if it's a rent control, that price ceiling means that these people don't get housing because there's not enough housing to go around, right? They would have bought housing at $600, but at $400, there's not enough for them. Same thing over here with the price floor. If at equilibrium, the wage was $8 and the quantity of labor was 1,800, now with a minimum wage of $12, only 1,400 people have jobs. The consumer surplus goes from GHJ to just G. The producer surplus goes from IK to HI, and J and K are deadweight loss, economic activity that doesn't happen. a decrease in welfare for everyone. Okay? So that's an inefficiency. And that's why economists really don't like price floors and price ceilings. So that's it for this chapter. I know it was a big chapter. There's a lot of information in here. So please hit up the discussion thread. Let me know what questions you have. Let me know what you think is the most interesting, the most boring, what's realistic, what's unrealistic. And I'll see you next time. Thanks so much.